We did this audit because contaminated sites can impact both human health and the environment. There are also significant financial considerations, as these sites can be expensive to clean up and liabilities have to be recorded in the province's financial statements. The first section of our audit looked at the province's process to identify and manage contaminated sites it is responsible for. Overall, we found that there is no coordinated approach for assessing and managing risks for contaminated sites, and there is no department or entity responsible for creating a provincial approach to ensure appropriate action is taken on potential and known contaminated sites the province is responsible for. We focused our work at Departments of Lands and Forestry and Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal, as those departments hold most provincially owned lands and administer most of the provincially owned contaminated sites. The lack of a coordinated approach was evident, as we found that each department had different processes to identify sites. Not all potentially contaminated sites were tracked, and historical information was not readily available. At Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal, we found that a process to assess and prioritize the operational basis was developed in 2010, but was not continued. We found one site had been given a high risk rating for contamination in 2010. However, there was no evidence to determine if any cleanup had been completed on this site since that time. Ongoing monitoring and tracking of sites are important to ensure management has appropriate information to make resourcing decisions, and to assess potential risks arising from future activities on the site. We also found that the province does not have a process to prioritize site evaluations and remediation. Provincial resources, both funding and staff time, are limited. Therefore, prioritizing the use of provincial resources is essential. We found that work has recently begun at the Department of Lands and Forestry to evaluate the 69 historic mine sites to assess potential risks and prioritize site evaluations. We reviewed draft documentation and found that Lands and Forestry had defined criteria to assess the mine sites based on the impacts to human health and the environment. This work is important, and while I'm pleased that planning is underway, Lands and Forestry should have taken steps to determine if mine sites were in compliance with the Contaminated Sites regulations when they were released in 2013. A systematic, coordinated approach would have resulted in the abandoned mine sites being assessed in a more timely manner. The second section of our audit was to follow up on the recommendations made in our 2010 audit of the Contaminated Sites program at the Department of Environment. When we last followed up on the recommendations in May of 2014, we assessed one recommendation as no longer required and removed it from the future follow-up assignments, and 11 of 16 recommendations were assessed as not complete. When we reassessed them in this audit, over 10 years after we initially issued our report, we found that 4 of the 16 recommendations are still not complete, exposing the department to risks, including potential costs associated with the cleanup of a contaminated site in cases where persons responsible lack financial resources, staff not following performance standards or policies and procedures, and inconsistent information in the electronic tracking system. It is important to note that in the 10 years since we made our initial recommendations, the department has undergone significant change, and while progress has been made towards completing the 4 remaining recommendations, additional work is still needed. We made 1 recommendation to the Department of Environment and 3 recommendations to the province, including assigning responsibility for implementing a consistent, coordinated approach for contaminated sites the province is responsible for to an oversight body. All the recommendations were agreed to. It is now up to the province to implement the recommendations to improve the identification and management of contaminated sites the province is responsible for.